Welcome to The Lost Debate, a show for political eclectics. I'm Ravi Gupta, and this is one of the most important episodes we've done in a while. I interview Heidi Blake, who wrote this super comprehensive piece all about Andrew Tate, the sort of misogynistic influencer and potential sex trafficker, alleged sex trafficker. And this story is crazy. And whatever you think you knew about Andrew Tate, I promise you, it is so much worse than you thought. He is more influential and more nefarious than even I realized at a cursory level. So this is going to be an important one. Obviously, we're going to touch on a lot of sensitive topics. So, if you got little ones around, this is not the one to have on speaker. But without further ado, let's just jump right into this interview. Heidi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Heidi, I've probably interviewed hundreds of people over the years, and I think this is, the most sort of bewildered I've been about where to start. This is a long and comprehensive and very sad piece that you wrote for The New Yorker about Andrew Tate. And I was struggling to be like, where do we start here? And I think the starting point for me is a conversation I've been having repeatedly. I'm a former school principal, so I've spent a lot of time around young people and young men. And I've noticed just the increased dominance of this guy, Andrew Tate, and his kind of progeny online. And I've had a series of very frustrating conversations with people in my life, including educators and parents, who do not seem to take seriously the scope of this man's influence. So maybe as a starting point, just lay down at a broad level how far Andrew Tate's reaches.
Andrew Tate's influence is really hard to overstate. I'm not sure we've ever seen anything quite like it. Like he built a huge following on social media, mainly by kind of flexing the wealth that he had acquired through the online exploitation that we'll talk about, I think, later in the podcast, of women. But he flexed that wealth online. He kind of developed this sort of mode of posting about diamond watches, supercars, private jets, kind of all the trappings of this life of great fortune that he had acquired for himself. And he developed a kind of regular sized social media following that way. And then he devised this really ingenious way to expand that reach, which was to set up this online school called Hustlers University, which basically functioned as a gigantic content factory. So like about 160,000 men enrolled in this online school. They were offered an affiliate marketing program, which where they earned commissions for reposting Andrew Tate's content. And they were given access to a huge library of his videos and his podcasts, and made money by reposting them. And so suddenly in the summer of 2022, his content absolutely exploded. These thousands and thousands of fan accounts started pumping clips of his videos into these social media algorithms, which we now know are already primed to amplify extremist and misogynistic content. And that was really where Andrew Tate found the kind of the force multiplier of his fame, was in these posts where he ranted about women, about the way in which he claims that modern society crushes and emasculates men. And it was posting that kind of content that made him a massive star of the manosphere. And so suddenly in that summer, his content just exploded and was everywhere. It was on the phone screens of young men all around the world. In the summer of 2022, which is when he really got big, his videos were viewed 12 billion times on TikTok alone. I mean, this reach is extraordinary. And so it's like millions of classrooms, millions of homes all around the world. Andrew Tate is suddenly blowing up the screens of these young men. And his rhetoric, this kind of violent misogynistic rhetoric that he specializes in, suddenly is in the mouths of teenage boys all around the world.
Yeah, and we'll get to a little bit more on the details of what his message is. But when you say violent misogynistic rhetoric, I think a lot of people now are kind of trained to be like, oh, like, what do we mean? Like, are you taking things out of context? Are we in words as violence mode and all this? And, we'll get to the violence, but there's also the explicit advocacy for violence against women that dovetails with a pattern of allegations against him and the people around him is what we're concerned about. Among like that's like problem A. There's a B, C, and D problem of just rhetoric in general that demeans women, advocates for a a sort of very backwards, you know, I don't even know how to describe it, like medieval version of society. We'll get to all of this, but let's turn back the clock for a second. And, you know, this guy, I don't want to do too much of like his family origin story. People could read about that in the book, but let's pick up with Andrew Tate, the kickboxer. So at a certain point, he's building a career as a successful kickboxer, and then he makes a pivot.
That's right. So yeah, Andrew Tate was a 4 times kickboxing world champion. He was a really talented fighter with a real gift for showmanship in the ring. But kickboxing doesn't pay very much money, even at the very top of the sport. He was making like maybe $50,000 for a title fight. And by the time he's paid his manager and his trainer, he doesn't have much money left over. And so he's really dissatisfied with this way of making money. And so in early 2014, which was the year he won his 4th world title, he sat down and decided he was going to try and figure out how to really make himself rich. He'd always been very preoccupied with money. He grew up very poor. He'd always been infuriated when he saw, you know, a guy drive by in a Ferrari. He was just like, why on earth can this guy have that kind of money and I can't? And so he sits down and he decides to make a list of everything he owns and try and figure out, you know, what can he work with here to try and make himself some money. And it's a really dispiriting exercise. So he's like, you know, I rent my flat, I owe money on my car, I barely even own any furniture, I really don't have very much to my name. And then he kind of has this realization, which in his retelling of this moment, he kind of casts this as this great moment of entrepreneurial genius. He realizes he has these women in his life who are his girlfriends. He has multiple girlfriends at once. He considers them an asset, and he decides he's going to find a way to monetize that asset. And so he's thinking, how can I make money from these women? He's in his retelling of this, he says that he knew some street pimps at the time, and he considered that as a career path, but felt like he didn't like the idea of other men touching what he considered to be his property, these women. He thought about opening a strip club and making these women dance in a strip club, but then he thought the upfront costs of all that are too high. And then he had this realization that what he could do instead was tap into this nascent industry, webcam pornography. He could get these women to stream online and to give their money to him. And that was a very cheap and easy way to start making money from these women who had fallen in love with him. And so that's what he did. He called his women to Luton. He sat them all down and he said, ladies, I'm going to start a webcam business. You're all going to work for me. You're going to make a ton of money. Most of them left. There was one who stayed, and she became his first webcam worker.
And the setup here, as alleged, is kind of a pattern that we see like from then forward, which is he sets up some kind of house, now compound, where he brings people in, and we'll talk about his recruitment tactics, but he brings them in and he pushes them to stream as much as possible. In some cases, you were chronicling people streaming for up to 17 hours a day. And they kind of tag team it where somebody's messaging the men, somebody's streaming, and the vast majority of the cut, like any pimp, goes to Tate and his brother. And then many of these women start to describe coercive and abusive behavior in and around this whole setup. And this is a repeated pattern.
That's right. So the very first woman that Andrew Tate recruited to this webcam operation was a Slovakian teenager he'd met in 2012. He says that he met her in 2012. That year she turned 15, he was 26. And a couple of years later, he asked her to come to Luton and start streaming online for him. At that point, she's 17. Now, in the UK and the US and many countries around the world, it's illegal to make sexual images of anybody under 18. So that what they were doing would fall under child pornography laws, what Tate was doing in compelling this woman to make this pornography. But online, he created this account for her where she became a Russian woman in her 20s, and they began making this sexual content. Sometimes Tate would have sex with her on camera. Sometimes she would be streaming alone. But there are a number of videos from that period where he is clearly being extremely violent towards her. You can see him whipping her with a belt while she sobs and begs him to stop. And he tells her, this is what happens when you don't listen. This is what happens when you don't obey me. Now, around that time, a number of other women started working for his business. Two of them went on to accuse Andrew Tate of rape and strangulation during the period of time when they were working for him in that same apartment as that first recruit. And that pattern then continued. So Andrew Tate left the UK after these two women went to the police and made those allegations. He skipped the country, he moved to Romania. And then for many years, he seemed to operate in Romania with a kind of impunity. You know, I could see in court files that women had gone to the police before. There were other cases where the police had done nothing after evidence emerged that women were being coerced or trafficked into sex work by the Tates. But they continued to build this business by their own description. But at the height of their webcam empire, they had 75 women working for them all at once and living in these different properties. And I went and spoke to a number of those women, and they described conditions of coercion, of violence, of psychological manipulation, in which they were not allowed to leave the compound. They were not allowed to go out unattended. They were not allowed to have relationships with other men. They were isolated from their friends and family. They were kept completely in the dark about how much money was being made from their streaming online, from these sex shows that they were performing. They were often tattooed with the Tate brothers' names. They had Tate property or Tate owned, or the names of one of the brothers tattooed on them. And they describe being subjected to acts of really harrowing sexual violence.
Yeah, and it's important to note how much is consistent across people's stories, right? And you know, there's no easy way to talk about this, but it often involves strangulation. There's a pretty common phenomenon where people describe that, like, after an encounter with him, their eyes are sort of pink or dotted from the strangulation. It also dovetails with his own descriptions. Like, maybe you can get into this, is that the amount of evidence here is overwhelming in some cases. It's like multiple women's accounts, sometimes where they're waking up and he's either assaulting them or somebody next to them. He strangles them. He threatens them afterwards. But it also dovetails with his own descriptions of his own behavior in his own content, but also in text messages. I mean, like, just give us a sense of how much evidence we have here.
Yeah, the evidence, I think, is really overwhelming. You know, Andrew Tate has said since he was arrested in Romania in 2022 on sex trafficking charges, he's consistently denied any wrongdoing. He said there's no evidence. He said there's no case. He said the whole thing is going to fall away. It's just a political smear campaign. That's part of why I set out to investigate this, because I wanted to understand, you know, what's really going on here? What is the evidence in this case? You know, most of it's all sealed away in Romania. And so I wanted to get into it. And I obtained a large volume of the Tate brothers' correspondence and internal documents, as well as prosecutorial files, sealed court records, which really show their conduct over the past 10 years. And the evidence is voluminous. You know, there are text messages in relation to one of the original UK victims who reported him to the police back in 2015, in which Andrew Tate literally writes to her, "I love raping you." He says, "Monsters are monsters." He says, you know, "Am I a bad person? I loved how much you hated it." Like, there are clear messages where he's describing acts of sexual violence. There's a pattern of conduct where women are again and again describing being assaulted in the exact same way. And these are women in different places who don't know each other, having these experiences at different times. And then there are these videos, which Andrew Tate himself made and sold to members of this online men's network that he established, that he calls the War Room, as part of an online course that he called his Pimping Hose degree, where he describes how to systematically recruit and subjugate women. And he describes subjecting these women to what is clearly emotional psychological coercion. He also talks a lot online about sexual violence. You know, he's said publicly, "Choke her till she can barely breathe, tell her she's yours forever." There's a famous video of Andrew Tate where he lies on a bed waving a machete and describes threatening a woman with a machete and then raping her and choking her at the same time. You know, he has talked openly about this kind of sexual violence and about this kind of systematic subjugation of women. But since his arrest on sex trafficking charges, he's developed this line of argument where he says that all he's doing is simply playing a character online, and that he didn't mean any of what he said before about oppressing women, about sexual violence. That was all just an act. It was all for entertainment. It was just meant to draw attention to a much more moderate message about traditional masculinity and about the way in which he feels men around the world are being oppressed. And therefore that we should just ignore all of that. But I think, as you very astutely observed, there's a very clear dovetailing between the allegations that many women have made, the evidence that we can see in his own text messages and documentation, and his own pronouncements, his own description of his behavior over the past 10 years, which does add up to a very compelling picture.
The obvious question is, how does this guy get away with it? right? So we have three different important venues here that we can kind of go through in order: the UK, Romania, and then the United States. And I want to end that sort of discussion on the United States because I think there's some unique political stuff going on here that actually in some ways related, right? But let's start with the UK. I recently read Patrick Radden Keefe's London Falling, and there's this other book called The Secret Barrister. I think I read in law school. I don't know if you've ever read this book.
Yeah.
And I mean this no offense, but I am constantly bewildered by the incompetence of the British prosecutorial and police services in these cases. Like, and I know I'm from the United States. We have our own problems, but even by our standards, there's some crazy levels of casual treatment of these serious cases that is it they're under resourced or whatever, but help me understand what happened with the UK cases given all the evidence that you just described.
I think you're absolutely right, and it's extraordinary to me as someone who's lived and reported in the UK for many years now, how many kind of major global scandals somehow have their roots in the incompetence of kind of ordinary British cops on the street who just totally failed to get to grips with a major crime when they stumbled across it. But yeah, we have in this case with Andrew Tate a situation where you had actually three women in the UK all went to the police, all described being assaulted, strangled by Andrew Tate. Two of them said that he'd raped them. Two of them said that they'd been kind of pushed into this sex work for him while he was subjecting them to these kinds of acts of violence. And these three women all make this report. There were catastrophic failures in the investigation by police in the very first instance. So one of those three women was discouraged from even making a statement by police. They told her it was going to be a long and distressing process and kind of shooed her away. Two of the other women, their statements were taken improperly. One of them was not recorded on video, but taken down sloppily by a police officer who got Andrew Tate's name wrong and called him Michael, among a number of other errors that were introduced into her account, which then, devalued the evidence that she later did give on camera because there were all these discrepancies. And I think most shockingly of all, the police didn't properly download the evidence on Andrew Tate's phone when they seized it, but, it was left lying around the station while the investigation kind of gathered dust. Which meant that by the time it was downloaded, the evidence on it was pretty much worthless. It couldn't really be adduced at trial. And then prosecutors had actually tried to salvage the case and had given the police who were working the investigation a list of leads which they were supposed to follow so that the case could be brought to trial, and they didn't follow up on any of them. So it was just this extraordinary case of total police incompetence, and officers around who were working in the police around that time said to me that these sorts of cases were just not taken seriously, in part because two of these women were sex workers. They were just not believed. The allegations were not treated as serious. Proper steps weren't taken. One of the officers I spoke to said to me, this was just one of many rape cases that were totally cocked up by poor policing. And so as a result, 10 years later, we have the rise of Andrew Tate. We have so many other women making similar allegations. And we have reports of pretty terrifying sexual violence against women around the world, which are now being linked to Andrew Tate's teachings. So it really is, it's a pretty startling object lesson in how far-reaching the consequences can be when the police fail to listen properly to women when they come forward and take their allegations seriously. But in the meantime, while nothing was being done about this investigation, Andrew Tate decided that he wasn't going to stick around in the UK. He left the country. He went to Romania. He's talked pretty openly about how he left the country because of this rape investigation, because he wanted to get away and he wanted to be in a more conducive environment for building his webcam empire. And so he upped sticks, moved to Romania, and then pretty much bragged for the next half decade that he was above the law. He talked openly on social media and to his associates about paying bribes to officials, about being kind of operating with total impunity, saying that he had the entire country of Romania locked from top to bottom, MPs, police chiefs, street thugs, anyone you wanted, he had them in his pocket. And so he really seems to feel that he was untouchable there. And I think that explains why he spent such a long time very publicly talking about the way in which he was exploiting the women he was recruiting into his online porn business, because I think he didn't think that anyone was going to take any action. And so when he was ultimately raided in 2022 by police in Romania and ultimately indicted on sex trafficking charges, I really think that came as a massive surprise to him.
And the scope of that indictment was what? I saw, you had written that there were sort of initial charges, but they planned to potentially indict him for up to 35 incidents or women. What did they eventually indict him on?
That's right. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about the way that indictment came about was that this happened under the Biden administration. The Biden administration had kind of repeatedly raised issues with Romania about the fact that it's pretty much viewed as the European capital of sex trafficking. There's a very large number of trafficking victims in the EU who originate in Romania. And so there was pressure being put on Romania by the US State Department to get to grips with sex trafficking, particularly because official corruption in Romania plays a pretty significant role in the trade. And so there was pressure to crack down on that. Now, in April of 2022, the Tate brothers recruited a US woman, a US citizen, a young woman from Miami, Florida, arrived at their compound in Bucharest after being kind of romanced in the traditional way by Tristan Tate, the way that they'd kind of honed over the years of approaching a woman, romancing her, flirting with her, flattering her, and kind of developing a romantic relationship with her, and then recruiting her to come to Romania and trying to get her online and performing sex shows for them. This was all going on with this US citizen, but pretty soon after she arrived at the compound, she started sending text messages home to her parents and to her family friends saying, I think these guys are sex traffickers. You have to, I need help. And talking about other women in the property who were also in need of assistance. Her family and this family friend reported this to the US Embassy, who alerted the local police. And it's at that point that finally the local police, who have previously done nothing about allegations that the Tates were coercing women, finally they send a raid team in to take the women in this house into protective custody. And so that's how this whole case originates. I think that's where there's this kind of tipping point. And at that point, so the Tates were then indicted for trafficking the women who they were housing in that particular property into sex work. They were indicted for forming an organized crime gang to traffic women alongside several associates. And that indictment kind of started proceeding. And then the prosecutor started building a much wider case, having got hold of the Tate brothers' electronic devices in the raids on their compound. The prosecutors then tracked dozens of other women who they had also allegedly trafficked into sex work. And there were also some charges in relation to the rape of a minor against Andrew Tate. And so the case began to proceed in that way and kind of gathered steam for a couple of years until we got to the election of Donald Trump in 2024. And then suddenly things seemed to change.
Yeah, so heading into that election, Andrew Tate's sort of empire of sorts is crumbling. He's telling people around him that he's running out of money, which is astounding given the amount of money that was at issue. But he had he had an ostentatious lifestyle, but also he had a lot of people on his payroll, including former police officers from Romania. There's one a female police officer, for example, who kind of ran his internal security. And as you outline in your piece, allegedly was committing her own crimes. I don't know how to describe it, but she's intimidating women under their care, threatening them. I forget the name of the group chat, but it's something really ominous between these women.
Suspicious Death. Yeah, these two female enforcers working for the Tates had a group chat with the women working in the house, which was called Suspicious Death, in which they would issue instructions about what they were supposed to be doing online and also issue threats when they failed to comply.
Yeah, threats that were very aligned with the idea of a suspicious death. I forget, you quote one of them directly. It's very chilling.
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the things the Tate brothers would do with the women who work with them is often pay for them to have breast enlargement surgery. And there's one point where one of these two enforcers says to one of the women they've recruited, instead of a breast enlargement, you're going to go directly to the morgue, as a result of her having sort of fallen behind on her online streaming requirements. She also texted her, punch yourself 10 times in the mouth and I'll give you 10 more when I get there. There are a number of very clear threats of violence made against the women working in the house by these two women. And, you could see in the messages that Tristan Tate was directing some of this. He texted them at one point, hit her if you have to, I don't care, when sending these women around to recover money that, they felt another woman owed them. So, it was really an atmosphere of fear, coercion, violence and abuse.
And so he views his get out of jail free card, literally, the election of Donald Trump. And he's explicit about his belief that Trump is going to be a turning point for him. He's a, big fan of Donald Trump. Trump wins. Tate celebrates it online. And in and around this period of time, I tried to catalog all of the different connections he has to the American right. He has relationships with CPAC, Don Jr., Tucker Carlson, Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens, Barron Trump. JD Vance followed him online. I guess is a little more cursory, but we could talk about that. Alina, I forget how to say her name. Habib.
Habba, I think. We should check that.
Yeah. And then Rich Grinnell, who had the unfortunate privilege to follow at the United Nations. I worked at the United Nations mission in New York for Obama, right after Grinnell was running comms for our predecessor. So he has relationships with the right. I think like people listening to this might be, well, like he might like Trump, but does Trump like him? What do we know about how the people in Trump's orbit and the American right treat Tate, and whether they've delivered anything for Tate in the name of sort of diplomatic pressure?
Well, there's kind of interesting confluence of events in around 2022 when Andrew Tate, both was initially arrested on these sex trafficking charges and was also ejected from all mainstream social media sites at the moment that his fame was exploding. And he was really becoming a defining figure in the kind of masculinist movement that has become a uniting force for the MAGA coalition. This idea of reasserting patriarchal power, rolling back the gains of feminism, and trying to restore men to what Andrew Tate talks about as their natural masculine imperative for power. And that was a message that was very politically useful to the MAGA movement and to many in conservative circles. And so when Andrew Tate was banned from social media, he was embraced by people like Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump Jr. as a free speech martyr. And when his arrest followed pretty quickly off the back of that, it was easy for them to portray that as being part of a campaign to silence somebody who wasn't woke, who wasn't kind of towing the line. He was pushing back against the liberal agenda. And so he was roundly defended. Again, Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump Jr., Elon Musk, all these people, Charlie Kirk, lined up to defend him, and in many cases to pronounce him totally innocent of all wrongdoing, I think without really knowing very much about what on earth he was up to in Romania, as far as I can tell. But they were all too ready to defend him. And when it came to Donald Trump's re-election campaign, Barron Trump had been tasked with delivering a young male audience. Andrew Tate made overtures to Barron. He already had a personal relationship with Don Jr. going back several years. He made overtures to Barron and really kind of promised to deliver those young male voters. And he did so in spades. He mobilized a young male vote in such large numbers that Kamala Harris ultimately singled Andrew Tate out as a key agent of her defeat. And pretty much immediately after Donald Trump was reelected, Andrew Tate started publicly declaring, Trump is the president, the Tate brothers are going to be freed. And meanwhile, their kind of staff, they'd assembled like a large team of lawyers, political advisors, PR operatives who were all maneuvering behind the scenes to try to enlist supporters to get the travel ban they were being held under in Romania lifted so they could travel the world and continue making their content and continue building their political ties and alliances and expanding their influence. They enlisted the help of Richard Grinnell, according to key members of the team. I spoke to their former spokeswoman, Matea Petrescu, who worked with them for several years, very prominently, who told me that Rick Grinnell was rooting for the brothers, had been enlisted to root for the brothers, and was deployed to approach the Romanian foreign minister at the Munich Security Conference last year, and to directly raise the Tate brothers case with the foreign minister. The foreign minister confirmed to me that he had discussed the case with Grinnell, and this created this real sense of American pressure on the Romanians.
And what was Grinnell's role in the administration at that point?
So he was a special presidential envoy, and so he was there kind of traveling the world representing the Trump agenda, and he made public that he was supporting the Tate brothers. He raised their case with the Romanian foreign minister at the Munich Security Conference. The two of them discussed it. And I was told by Matea Petrescu that it was only a couple of days later that prosecutors reached out to the Tate brothers or to their lawyers and said, what do the Americans want? Like, what do they want here? And they were told these guys need to be released from their travel ban. And it happened almost immediately. And so within days, the Tate brothers were on a private jet traveling to Florida, released from their ban, and have since then been traveling freely around the world. And when I met them personally, they very clearly said to me the case against them was totally doomed. It was not going to go anywhere now. And indeed, I could see in private messages I obtained between them and their advisors that they were explicitly discussing that they were being protected by Romania now, that like nothing was going to happen against them. Meanwhile, in the UK, there is now a case against them for rape and sex trafficking against both of the brothers. But a Romanian court has ruled they can't be extradited to face justice in the UK until the Romanian case runs its course. And so there's this funny situation where the Romanian case is pretty much stalled for a long time. Not much is happening. the brothers feel they're being protected by the Romanian system. They can't be extradited to the UK to face charges, and they're released from any kind of travel ban. They're traveling around the world doing pretty much whatever they like. And so there are very real questions about whether they're going to face justice for any of this as a result of this intervention.
Now, the UK case is civil or criminal?
There are two cases in the UK. So there's a civil case, which is being brought by those victims I mentioned earlier. There were three women who went to the police in 2014 and 2015 to allege that they'd been sexually assaulted by Andrew Tate. They were joined by a fourth woman who said that she was also assaulted at that same time, also raped and strangled by him. She didn't go to the police at the time, but she has since joined the civil case. And so those four women are bringing this case because they didn't get justice through the police, because the case went nowhere. That will now, it's being delayed. It will be heard next year. And then there's also a criminal case being brought in the UK. So the brothers have been charged with 21 combined counts of rape and human trafficking and controlling prostitution for gain in the UK by prosecutors. But they, as I say, they can't come back and face justice here, or the courts have ruled that they will not be extradited while there's a Romanian case pending. And so that case is really just sitting there on ice, nothing happening, while they continue traveling around freely.
Yeah, and as he has this triumphal return to the United States. He goes to an MMA fight. He's greeted by Dana White, Kash Patel, and then he goes to, I think if I have my timeline correctly, he also is in California and is accused again of assault. Am I right?
That's right. So yeah, on this great return trip to the United States, they do this big victory lap, which is kind of a tour, like a publicity tour of conservative America. And Andrew Tate goes to LA, goes to the Beverly Hills Hotel, where he meets up with a model who he'd been kind of dating on and off. And she again alleges that he strangled her, battered her during sex, sexually assaulted her very violently. After he left, she went to a doctor and was diagnosed with post-concussion syndrome, and then went to the police and made a criminal complaint against him, and also a civil complaint in which she attached dozens of text messages that Tate had sent her, in which he threatened to beat and abuse her in a variety of pretty harrowing ways. The district attorney decided not to prosecute on that case. They said they're citing a lack of evidence. And the Tate brothers have now filed a defamation claim against the women who accused them, which is a pretty standard move of theirs, to kind of go after anybody who accuses them of wrongdoing very aggressively through the civil courts. But that's yet another example of a woman who says that she was violently assaulted because these guys are being allowed to just travel the world freely, doing whatever they please.
And what is the status of his relationship with the sort of Trump and right-wing media system now, today?
Well, there's been no disavowal of the brothers by the Trump administration. They've been reasonably quiet since the brothers were freed from their travel ban on the subject of the Tate brothers. They haven't kind of made any more very public interventions. But the brothers are traveling frequently to the US, where they kind of travel around and enjoy a great deal of freedom. This is all off the back of the pressure that that was placed on Romanian prosecutors by the US. So it'll be interesting to see how that relationship plays out. I'm interested to know whether there'll be any response to the evidence that's detailed in my story and that is kind of still emerging about the Tate brothers and their activities from those circles. But I think there are serious questions for people in and around the Trump administration who have so publicly supported the Tate brothers, given the scale of the evidence against them.
It is amazing to me that we have, this political movement predicated on not allowing criminal immigrants into our country. Yet there seems to be some serious allegations that they went out of their way to secure the free right of travel to the United States from this guy who has a mountain of allegations against him. And then he comes to the United States and then is alleged to have committed another crime while he's here. It is really astounding.
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary. And it's extraordinary to me also that so many of the figures on the right who have been so outspoken about sex trafficking and trafficking of children and minors seem to be so willing to totally overlook the evidence in relation to the Tate brothers, because the Tate brothers have been politically useful and are politically aligned with many of those figures. Elon Musk, who has tweeted and kind of done a lot to propagate conspiracy theories about Asian grooming gangs in the UK. It's tweeted suggesting that the case against the brothers is just a distraction from what he calls real or actual sex trafficking. And I think there's just a question mark about whether those characters are willing to believe that people who are aligned with them politically are capable of doing any such thing, regardless of the evidence and however voluminously it stacks up.
Yeah, and the amount of hypocrisy here is too much to describe, but you describe also how anti-religious he is. If the conservative movement includes so many evangelicals, obviously so many of the crimes he's committed have are immoral under any religion. But he also is quoted as saying, when a woman didn't want to be on webcams because of her religion, I think this is Andrew Tate, was quoted as saying, she never believed in God. Women never believe in anything.
Yeah, I found that a really particularly chilling quote of his. Just the utter contempt for this woman and her belief system and the values that she clearly held. She'd said to him, "I believe in God. My body is intimate. Only my husband should be able to touch and see it." And he boasted to his supporters and associates that he'd identified all her objections and destroyed them. He described himself as a shepherd leading the sheep, and yeah, as you say, said that she never believed in anything. He has publicly styled himself now as a Muslim. He said he converted to Islam a few years ago. And so he kind of portrays himself as being very devout. When he got out of jail, he emerged holding a copy of the Quran and said he was going to go back to his compound and pray. But I think many people question the sincerity of his conversion, given what we know about his views and attitudes.
Yeah, and the way he recruits people, I think, is worth he like Jeffrey Epstein and a lot of predators seem to have this knack for finding people in vulnerable positions, and he seeks them out and exploits their vulnerabilities, and then he has a community for which he then brags and teaches them how to exploit people's vulnerabilities.
That's right. Yeah, it's really one of the things I think that was most striking for me in reporting on this and studying the messages that were exchanged between the Tate brothers and their supporters and subscribers in the War Room, this men's network, in which they were teaching these techniques of recruiting and exploiting women, was just how systematic this was and how studied it was. They had really spent so much time honing these techniques, codifying these techniques, the way in which you gradually wore down a woman's self-esteem, her beliefs, you gradually isolated her from her friends and family, you kept her constantly off balance and confused. You gradually normalized your mistreatment of her in a way that made it difficult for her to notice what was really going on. And all of these things were described explicitly. These guys were absolutely clear about what it was they were doing and teaching other men to do. And then the kind of tenor of the conversation between them and some of these associates who then are themselves recruiting women into sex work. And you can see them sharing screenshots of the women that they have working online for them, whose money they're taking. But they're really delighting in their mistreatment of these women. There's one guy who brags that he's making 6 figures from making his girlfriend stream online for 13 hours at a time. And he shares that he has her sleeping on a concrete floor in a garage with no AC and spiders and cockroaches. And he shares a photo of her live streaming in this really kind of grimy workspace and is celebrated. Tristan Tate says, "Awesome work." And so it's almost like that the cruelty towards these women, the utter contempt for these women, is a cause for celebration, is an article of pride for these guys. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right that kind of the way in which they identify and then exploit vulnerability is something really striking in these messages.
Yeah, you described one of the recruits and sort of star pupils. I think his name is Obusic or something.
That's right.
Who it seems like, based on your reporting, was chronicling his own abuse. He had hit his girlfriend / whatever we want to call his, trafficked his individual, workers, whatever, yeah. I don't know what it is, over the head with a keyboard.
That's right. Yeah. He's kind of asked by another member how he subdued unruly workers and talked about, he hit her on the head with a keyboard until she went into the room and worked for 7 hours without a break. And then he bragged that he'd hit every woman that he was with. He talked about how he'd bribed law enforcement to get off charges of battering people over the head with bricks. I mean, the level of kind of violence in these discussions is really shocking. And this guy, he talked freely about this, and then was really elevated by the Tates. He ends up getting his own Telegram channel within the War Room, where he's teaching what he calls raw, uncensored methods of pimping and handling women, alongside the Tate brothers, who also join him in that space. So yeah, there is a real celebration of pretty extreme cruelty and violence towards the women in this world.
Yeah, he was elevated. That's the key part here. It's not like he was punished and ostracized after he was sharing all this information. And I think this gets at the real threat of Tate. There's the acute threat of his behavior in the proximate sense to the people he victimizes, which is obviously quite serious and extensive in its own right. But there's this larger threat, which is he's now creating all these disciples. And so now we've gotten this situation where, yes, we have to prosecute him and hold him accountable for his behavior. But now we've got a movement of people out there who are training on trafficking women, mistreating women. And look, like, even if they weren't trafficking and mistreating women, which obviously there's pretty substantial evidence that they are, their ideology is very dangerous. So that even if you weren't like, if you're listening to this and you're like, well, the ideology is not criminal, but it needs to be taken seriously, right? Like if you don't think it's criminal, you still probably, if you're listening to this, think it's dangerous. And this is where I think we started, which is educators, parents, law enforcement. What are people to do about this?
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I really wanted this to be a story, that was not about speech, but was about action. It was about, this is what these guys have done, because they've managed to sort of reframe the case against them as being one about speech, and portray themselves as free speech martyrs. And so I wanted to kind of like put that aside and focus on, what did you guys actually do here? What's the evidence? But it's absolutely true that when you pan out and look at the scale of their influence around the world, it's really chilling. In the UK, police here have declared a national emergency over the upsurge in violence against women that they've explicitly linked to Andrew Tate and other influencers like him. They've warned that Andrew Tate is radicalizing young men in what they call a quite terrifying manner. And there have been really alarming reports of sexual violence and even murder by people who've recently consumed Andrew Tate's content. And so that is terrifying. But I think there are a number of real challenges for anybody trying to get to grips with this. One of which is that the Tate brothers' strategy of creating this affiliate network of fan accounts who pump out their content means that even by banning them on mainstream social media, you still have these thousands of other accounts to contend with who are just absolutely churning out Tate's message day in, day out. You also have the fact that his account on X has been reinstated by Elon Musk. He has a huge following on there. One of the things I uncovered was he had a big deal with Rumble, the online right-wing streaming site, to produce a large amount of content there. He's very, very active.
They're paying millions, right, a year.
That's right, $6 million a year for him to produce a few short videos and one live stream a week. So there's multiple different platforms where Andrew Tate's influence is strong and continues to grow. And then you have young men around the world who are very susceptible to this, particularly vulnerable teenage boys who are feeling lost in this very confusing and complicated political moment. And it's very difficult to know how to get to grips with that. I mean, I know that here in the UK, there have been lots of efforts in schools to go into schools and to talk to boys and to try to counter these teachings. And I think similar efforts are being made in other countries around the world, but it's a pretty complicated thing to unpick, I think, particularly when he remains at large and so active and continuing to spread his message. And as some of his victims have said, it's very complicated when you have this guy who has mistreated you in such horrific ways, who is out there free, and not only free, but being celebrated by some of the most powerful political figures in the world, being welcomed with open arms by, being sitting alongside the FBI director, at major sporting events. It's just, this guy is right up there at the top table in the world, while his victims look on in horror. And while his supporters, obviously see that and get a very clear message that there's nothing wrong here. There's something to be celebrated here. And so I do think it's a very thorny problem.
Yeah, it's now viewed as a path to success in many different ways. It's not just the money, it's the political power. And every day that he roams free, he serves as an example to people who are looking around saying, okay, this is a way to get what I want.
That's right.
Yeah, well, it's a really scary story. I recommend everybody to read it. And it's basically the entire New Yorker.
But yeah, I'm very, very grateful to have so much space to tell this story properly, because it is complex, and I think it felt really important to try to lay out chronologically the whole tale, like how this guy rose out of nowhere to become who he is, and then everything he's done since, and all the ways in which he was assisted by official ineptitude and deliberate efforts to aid him. So yeah, I'm, as always, so grateful to the New Yorker for supporting this kind of work.
I forgot to ask you one question, which is, he gave you some access. They talked to you, and I think you visited them. What?
That's right.
Why do you think they did that? Like, I was surprised that they didn't.
Yeah.
Cooperate is a strong term, but that they would even talk to you, I found surprising.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the reason that they wanted to talk was because they have a very clear account of all of this, which is that they are being targeted, that this is a political campaign against them, that Romania is a corrupt jurisdiction, and this whole case has just arisen from corruption. They were very keen, particularly Tristan was very keen for me to speak to a number of women who remain close to them, who have worked for them, and who have been listed as victims by Romanian prosecutors, but who remain staunchly loyal to the brothers. I think it's worth bearing in mind the strong element of coercion and duress involved in these allegations when you kind of listen to these women and their accounts. And one of the things I could see in my reporting was that while Andrew Tate was in prison, he was directing through his associates these women to make videos in which they were being told to say particular things about the Tate brothers.
And intimidating his accusers, which you chronicle. We don't have enough time to talk about here, but you chronicle in detail how
that's right.
He has, his army of supporters, lawyers, PR people, private investigators going after people who accuse him.
That's right, exactly. So I think that's all important to bear in mind. But I did speak to those women. I heard their stories. Many of them do reject the idea that they are victims and do defend the Tate brothers. But I think that they were eager to try to convince me that they had been targeted and that this was a political hit job. And I heard them out, and I was open to whatever they wanted to show. And I said to them, if you've got evidence of that, I'd love to see it. Please give me anything you've got. Nothing was forthcoming. And the evidence, as I say, against them is voluminous. But I am always grateful to anybody who's willing to sit down and spend time talking to me. And they, Tristan in particular, spent a lot of time with me. Andrew Tate came and saw us for about an hour. But the thing that was most striking for me in the room with Andrew Tate was that when he described this webcam operation, it was very, very clear that he was lying, and lying very, barefacedly and apparently without compunction about things that were so clear and obvious and disprovable that I kind of couldn't believe that he was prepared to do that. And I think it just kind of indicated to me that there was this complete disconnect with any sense of what had really happened, or any sense of objective truth about what had really happened in that conversation with him. Sometimes you sit down with someone and they tell you something and you think, okay, I really didn't know that. That's interesting. That changes the picture. In this instance, he told me things like, for example, that his entire webcam business had closed down 10 years before he was even raided by police. I mean, that's just such a demonstrable falsehood in so many ways, even by his own account over many years. I kind of couldn't believe he was sitting there and telling me that and looking me straight in the eye. But yeah, it was fascinating to spend time with them.
Whew. Well, Heidi, stay safe out there. Everybody who's listening, go out and read Andrew Tate's Empire of Exploitation by Heidi Blake. Heidi, is there anything else you want to plug, anywhere we could follow you?
Well, I continue to write to New Yorker, but no, pretty much no. I think I just don't really want to plug myself on X, which is like the only social media.
Yeah, that would be a weird.
No, I'm good. I continue to write for New Yorker, and so you can follow my work there. Thank you so much. This has been such a thoughtful, in-depth discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, Heidi. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Remember to rate, review, subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to subscribe on YouTube. You could also find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on podcasts, go over to YouTube and just hit subscribe. You can watch it over there, too. Have a great week, everybody.